Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth.
My civics teacher in the 9th grade was known as Chucky Hertz, H-U-R-T-S. And he was known as Chucky because he was well-liked. And he was well-liked not because he was a civics teacher, but because he was a basketball coach. In the world of high school athletics, it is not at all unusual for smaller, less competitive schools to look around their collection of teachers and see who is willing and able to be some sort of coach of some sort of team. But more common is for schools that are competitive to find an outstanding coach who has the minimal qualifications to be a teacher and who is given minimal responsibilities to be a teacher. Chucky Hertz was a great basketball coach. He was a friendly man and well-liked, but he wasn't much of a teacher, which I suspect is why he was put in charge of our civics class. In this particular civics class, we spent most of our days doing historical or political dittos of crossword puzzles. 7 across is George Washington crossed the what river? And he'd put in Delaware. That kind of thing was what we spent our time on, or writing little reports on current events and sharing those things in class. I honestly don't remember a word coming out of his mouth actually teaching us anything. Now, my point of this is not to harp on the school that I went to in the 9th grade, nor on Chucky, nor certainly not on civics, but just to suggest to you that we're really not a country that cares a great deal about what the law, what the formation of our government actually says and does. Exhibit A. Some time ago, the president went on national TV and suggested that he was going to affirm that through the organization known as OSHA, the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration, that administration or that sub department of the federal government charged with ensuring worker safety would implement a requirement that all companies with 100 employees or more have all of their employees be vaccinated or tested. And the next thing you know, all the people who are opposed to mandated vaccines, which would include me, I stand very clearly opposed to that. I've made it clear over the months that I'm not willing to take a particular stand on the efficacy of vaccines, but I'm perfectly willing to suggest that this is not a legitimate government function. But back to the issue at hand. So he makes this announcement, and the next thing you know, a bunch of people who are opposed to vaccines are screaming with their head on fire that the president has essentially passed a law requiring this. And I had to say to several of them, wait a minute. The president went on national TV and he said this is what he wanted to do. He hasn't done anything, A. And B, even if he does, there's every reason to believe that it won't be enforced because it's not legitimate. whatever we might believe about the authority of the president to make executive orders, this would stretch that understanding well beyond recognition. And sure enough, when he did actually place that order, which happened a month or so later, it was immediately challenged, and right now we're at a place where we've had different rulings from different courts of appeal in different parts of the country. So there are some states where this process has been halted and other states where it's not, and that's generally a first class express ticket to the Supreme Court. It may come to pass, and I think it's horrible. But what I think is even more horrible is that one of the reasons we live in a world where the president can say, yeah, I think you're all going to have to get a shot tomorrow, is because we know so little about what the law actually says. Now, I don't know whether President Biden doesn't know either what the law actually says. Maybe he had a basketball coach for a civics teacher when he was in school. But he either doesn't know, or more likely, I suspect, he doesn't care. And that's part of the great sort of unspoken, unknown conspiracy, this intersection of people in positions of power who have no interest in abiding by the rule of law, governing a group of people who have no idea what the law actually says. Think about it again in terms of the stimulus. This will make it nice and what's the word for it? Bipartisan. Since we had stimulus checks coming from the Republican when he was in office, and we had stimulus checks coming from the Democrat now that he's in office, I can offend everybody. Here's the simple truth. Nowhere legally does the federal government have the authority or the right to send checks to people. They can pay people to do jobs that are enumerated for the federal government in the Constitution, but they can't just write checks to the citizens. They can't tax people to pay for writing checks. They can't borrow money for the purpose of writing checks. Here's an experiment. I've asked this before. Here's what I'd like you to do to give you an idea of how absolutely dead in the water the Constitution of the United States is. What I want you to do is I want you to go online and Google a search for federal level cabinet departments. These are the departments in the executive branch of the federal government that have secretaries in charge. And the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Homeland Security, et cetera, which seems strange to me because that sounds a lot like defense. But look up that list and then look through a copy of the Constitution. Begin with the Bill of Rights and specifically the 10th Amendment, which says without ambiguity that unless a particular authority or power is given to the federal government in the Constitution, then the authority and power remains with the states or the people, which means the federal government can't have anything to do with it. Now see if you can find the function of each of these departments anywhere in the enumerated powers. Secretary of Defense, you'll be okay. Secretary of Education, you won't. Secretary of Labor, you won't. Secretary of Health and Human Services, you won't. The majority of cabinet-level departments have no constitutional standing, and yet no one, including Ronald Reagan, shut any of them down. What I'm trying to get at is they just don't care. Now, the solution is not for you not to care. The solution is for you to hold them to it. I want you to remember this too. Every time a congressperson is sworn into office, every time a senator is sworn into office, every time the president is sworn into office, they make a solemn oath in which they swear to protect and defend not their party, not the government, but to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. Which means every time one of them votes in favor of, a budget that includes money for a program or department not listed as a legitimate federal function, they're breaking their oath. They're lying. And when you lie about one thing, it can be something as small as, let's just say that there's this conservative senator. He's this heroic, strong, limited government guy. And he's just, the poster child for hardcore conservative people. And he votes in favor of a bill, let's say this, that requires that critical race theory not be taught in any schools that receive any federal funding. Which bill is enforced and implemented through the Secretary of Education. Now, we don't like critical race theory. Don't like it being taught in government schools. But when you support something like this, what you're saying is we think it's perfectly legitimate for the federal government to decide what can be taught in the schools. There's always, friends, the question before the question. Before we answer what should we do, we have to ask the question, do we have the liberty to do anything? Do we have the authority to do anything? Let me make it abundantly clear. Let's suppose that you could conduct some perfect experiment, and that perfect experiment could clearly and unambiguously demonstrate that if the federal government mandates everyone to get all the vaccines, then no one will be harmed and everyone will survive and the pandemic will go away. It's still not the right thing for the federal government to do because the federal government doesn't have the right to do it. I was talking with someone the other day about this and how a friend was asking my thoughts on Thomas Jefferson. And I said, I have some sympathy for him because I can't imagine what it must have been like for him being so central to the founding of the country, being so committed to the principles of limited government, having put together the Declaration of Independence, having worked on and affirmed the Constitution of the United States. And now he's sitting as president. And in a desperate move to save his war effort, Napoleon offers to sell the United States government this hunk of land called the Louisiana Purchase that doubles the square mileage of the nation. And you're Thomas Jefferson, you're thinking, man, this is big, this is huge. This could make a big difference in our... But wait a minute. We did not give power to the federal government to buy land like this. The truth is that Jefferson actually spoke to his gathered cabinet, which was 5 or 6 guys, not 30 people, and said, look, I don't think I have the authority to do this. I'd like to do it. So what we need to do is go through a process of amending the Constitution to give the federal government the authority to do that. I don't know if we can get that done in time to close the deal with Napoleon. And his advisors all said, well, Mr. President, we don't think you need to worry. You're being a little too fastidious here. Let's just go ahead and do this. No one's going to mind. Well, I get that, but I also get that this was the crack in the dam. And the next thing you know, the federal government's doing all sorts of things it's not supposed to do. And here we are a couple hundred years later, and they're telling us we got to get a shot whether we want to or not. This is not why we fought against the British. This is not the liberty that we supposedly sent our soldiers overseas to protect. And we should have learned this along the way. We have been blessed to be living in the most free country in the history of the world, and we are giving it away by the shovelful. All because we don't know what liberty is, we don't know what it costs, we don't know how to protect it, and more importantly, We just don't care.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.